Well, good morning. For those of you I've not yet had the chance to meet, my name is John Highbush. I'm the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you, and there are a lot of you here this morning, for our Perspectives on Leadership Forum, sponsored by one of our most generous Reagan Centennial sponsors, GE. Before we get started, I'd like to ask all of you to please remember to turn off your cell phones. We would really greatly appreciate that. Thank you. And once Mrs. Reagan and her special guest arrive at their seats, if you'd all please remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to welcome former First Lady Nancy Reagan, escorted by her special guest, former First Lady Laura Bush. Thank you. Now, in honor of our men and women in uniform who defend our freedom around the world every day, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize some special guests we have with us this morning. From our Board of Trustees, Mr. Brad Freeman, who serves on both the Reagan Foundation Board as well as the newly formed George W. Bush Foundation Board. Our Simi Valley Council members, Michelle Foster, Steve Soika, Barbara Williamson, and City Manager Mike Siddell. Our Ventura County Supervisor, Linda Parks. I think Linda's here. I think in honor of Mrs. Bush, we have 16 principals from Pinecrest Schools that are here. I'd like you to... Okay. And finally, we have 60 students and chaperones from St. Genevieve High School. I know you all are here. Now, I have said from this podium before that serving Mrs. Reagan and her fellow trustees in this role is a job of a lifetime for a number of reasons. One of them is definitely the honor of introducing some truly remarkable people, many of them heroes in their own right for their outstanding service to our country. Today is definitely no exception because our guest this afternoon is such a magnificent role model for so many. I am, of course, speaking of our former First Lady Laura Bush, who happens to be sitting right next to another tireless public servant and former First Lady Nancy Reagan. Well, you stole my applause line because this is a very special occasion to have them both together like this. And I would like you to join me in taking a moment to thank them for their years of service and sacrifice for our country. As we welcome Mrs. Bush, I would like you to consider, if you will, the job description of First Lady. And I'm using that term job description quite loosely because, as President Reagan once said, and I quote, "The government gets only one employee for free, the First Lady." If you think about it, the role of First Lady is probably both the single most important and single most underpaid job in the United States government. Now, let me demonstrate what I mean. I want you to imagine sitting one morning at the breakfast table, looking through the want ads in search of work, and you come across this one. Help wanted. Most powerful nation on earth seeks First Lady. No previous experience necessary. Willingness to relocate to Washington, D.C. a must. Work from home opportunity. Hours 6 a.m. through midnight, Monday through Friday, weekends included. Employer seeks the impossible. Demonstrated perfection as a human being required. Willingness to undergo scrutiny as the most famous woman on the planet 24/7, from hairstyle to positions on peace in the Middle East. Superhuman multitasking a must. Background in planning of state dinners, hosting of international summits on foreign soil, standing in for weekly national radio addresses, defense of spouses' public positions on over 1,000 issues, and flawless media performances before mobs of cynical reporters preferred. Salary, zero, not negotiable. Benefits include exciting travel alone to exotic, war-torn, and disease-ridden destinations, intense scrutiny of family, and round-the-clock security by men and women in dark suits and sunglasses living at your home for the rest of your life. Minimum 4-year commitment. Apply in person at the White House, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The United States is an equal opportunity employer. Now, I have been accused on occasion of exaggeration, but I know there are 2 women in this room who have the combined experience of 16 years in this role who can vouch for me. On many days, this job description does not seem that far off. Thankfully for all of us in our nation, Laura Bush responded to this ad successfully, and the rest is history. I know that Mrs. Reagan and all of you who have joined us today would agree that Laura Bush more than answered the call as First Lady with extraordinary grace and eloquence. Whether you found her in Burma, whether she was to be found in Burma or Afghanistan on behalf of the rights of women, in Africa to press the cause for HIV/AIDS prevention, or here at home advancing the causes of global literacy, breast cancer awareness, heart disease, and at-risk youth, her 82% approval rating from the American people is evidence enough that she succeeded beyond what were probably the wildest dreams of a young girl from the desert and big sky of West Texas. And like Nancy Reagan, she continues to make a positive impact on our lives. She is with us here today in part because of the release of her groundbreaking memoir, one that I know all of you will enjoy. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to First Lady Laura Bush.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you very much, John. I really appreciate it. And in case some of you don't know, John is the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. I also especially want to thank Mrs. Reagan. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today and for being a part of this morning's events. Thank you, and thank you for your wonderful service to our country. I'm going to make just a few remarks and read just a couple of passages from my new book. This is the book tour that I'm on, after all. And I want you all to know that I'm thrilled to be back visiting this beautiful library, which illustrates so well the wonderful legacy of Ronald and Nancy Reagan. George and I visited here several times. I visited a couple of times alone with when Nancy Reagan and I introduced the Red Dress Project to promote women's heart health. And then a lot of you might have been there then. And then George and I came back when the wonderful hangar was opened to display President Reagan's Air Force One. And that was a thrill, and I know it's a thrill for all of you and a huge asset to have this in your part of the country here in the Simi Valley. The first time I ever visited the White House was at the kind invitation of Ronald and Nancy Reagan. And I want to just read what I put in my book about that. When George and I were invited to a Sunday afternoon concert performed by Itzhak Perlman, we had decided to make a special trip to Washington. George packed his nicest suit, and I had a fancy dress. We were both nervous about going to the White House. Inside, women gingerly picked their way over the slick marble stairs and halls. My eyes wandered, taking in the velvet and brocade, and the heavy wooden tables and carved chairs, the high ceilings, glittering chandeliers, and the crush of far more elegantly dressed people in each room. We sat on gold banquet chairs that had been precisely arranged in rows across the East Room, with a special roped-off section for the most important dignitaries. And we waited patiently in the receiving line to shake President and Mrs. Reagan's hands. When the military aides announced us, both George and I were speechless. We smiled, staying mute, having no idea what to say. Now, after years of receiving lines, I'm grateful for the people who don't say anything. Except I'm so happy to be here and just keep on moving. It can take hours for the President and First Lady to shake all of those hands. We also attended our first state dinner during the Reagan administration, when President Bush, of course, was vice president. But with 5 vice presidential children, and most of them married, it wasn't easy to get in rotation for an event to a state dinner. I remember George's dad asking once if we'd been to a state dinner, and we said no. Months passed, and George finally said, "Dad, what about that state dinner?" And Vice President Bush responded, "Oh no, I said steak dinner." George and I have long admired Ronald Reagan. I'm proud to say that we got to campaign for him and his vice presidential candidate in 1980 and 1984. It was Ronald Reagan who gave hope to dissidents and freedom fighters around the world during the Cold War, who was unequivocal that the United States must stand for freedom. This is one of the things George said at Ronald Reagan's funeral. And Ronald Reagan believed in the power of truth in the conduct of world affairs. When he saw evil camped across the horizon, he called that evil by its name. There were no doubters in the prisons and gulags where dissidents spread the news, tapping to each other in code what the American president dared to say. There were no doubters in the shipyards and churches and secret labor meetings where brave men and women began to hear the creaking and rumbling of a collapsing empire. And there were no doubters among those who swung hammers at the hated wall as the first and hardest blow had been struck by President Ronald Reagan. I'm proud that George was able to build upon that legacy during his 2 terms. And today, the George W. Bush Institute at SMU is establishing a special program to support dissidents around the globe. To stand for freedom is to stand on the right side of history. We also have something else in common. Nancy and Ronald Reagan loved the West, and so did George and I. But just how deeply the West has shaped us, the open skies and vast spaces, the mountains and the land, became clear to me when I began to write my memoir. Originally, my publisher had wanted this book to be just about our years at the White House. Our years in Washington, the first decade of a new century, were as consequential as any in our history. We lived through the most vicious attack on our homeland in the history of our nation. I was on Capitol Hill on the morning of September 11th, sitting in the office of Senator Ted Kennedy, preparing to give a briefing to his Education Committee when the World Trade Center was engulfed in flames, the Pentagon was struck, and a few dozen brave men and women defeated their hijackers above a grassy Pennsylvania field. George and I cried with the grieving families, and we prayed with the nation, and we never forgot that day for the rest of his time in office, and we'll never forget it for the rest of our lives. I met so many brave men and women who had volunteered to defend our country, who risk and give their lives so that the rest of us might never know terror again. And I've met the voices for freedom, like the former Czech president, Václav Havel, the great intellectual and playwright who for years was imprisoned by the communists, but who never gave up his hopes for freedom. When the Iron Curtain fell, he stepped up to lead his country, and he's still speaking out on behalf of the oppressed. I met the Dalai Lama from Tibet and female candidates for parliament in Kuwait who ran for office in 2006, the first year that women there were given the right to vote. And I met women in Afghanistan who under the Taliban could not get an education, who would have their fingernails pulled off if they so much as dared wear a coat of fingernail polish, who were beaten for wearing shoes that made too much noise when they walked. Now their lives are changing. In my book, I wanted to give voice to all of these remarkable people. And I wanted to remember the many people I met here at home, the volunteers from the Red Cross and the Baptist men who drove all night to the storm-ravaged Gulf Coast after Katrina to cook meals for those in need, and who stayed for months helping the people there rebuild, or the brave Coast Guard volunteers who rescued some 30,000 stranded people after the hurricane struck. I think that's a fact that most people don't know. I wanted to tell the days I spent with young men in our cities and towns, many of whom were ex-gang members and who were trying to turn their lives around. I was never prouder than when, as part of my own Helping America's Youth initiative, I was able to welcome a group of ex-gang members from LA to the White House, the same house where we hosted the Queen of England and the Pope on his birthday. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had some great stories to tell. January 20th, 2009 came and went, and we went home to Texas. I knew that I couldn't write a book just about the White House. I had to write about my home and George's home as well. We're Texans. Who we are, what we value, how our lives was formed by Texas, shaped by our friends there, our family there, and our life there. So I wrote a book both about the White House and Texas. And that brings me to one more thing that I'm proud to share with Nancy Reagan, a love story. She loves her husband, and I love mine. our years at the White House were happy ones for both of us because we each loved the man we lived with in the White House. Nancy and I shared also a deep sense of responsibility for the White House itself, that beautiful building that we got to call home for 8 years. Nancy did such a beautiful job of stewardship with the White House that Barbara Bush told me when she moved in, every single thing was perfect. And she didn't have to do a single room for the 4 years she lived there. So I wanted to read you this passage from the book. For 8 years, every day that I was in the White House, I walked past the black lacquer screen that Nancy Reagan had added to the cavernous yellow upstairs hallway to make it appear a bit smaller in scale. Day after day, Barb Bush and Hillary Clinton had passed it too, and there was great comfort in that continuity. To live in the White House is to live with your predecessors, with their decorating, their renovations, their furniture. Bill Clinton's Oval Office couches, recovered, were now in our residence upstairs. George and I both pored over biographies and histories of the men and women who had inhabited these walls. Our bedside tables were crowded with books about their lives. And there was a real solace to this constant reminder of what had gone before, to know that from within these walls, Franklin Roosevelt had faced the Pearl Harbor attack. Abraham Lincoln had agonized over the Civil War, and tens of other presidents had struggled with their Congresses and their consciences as well. Our presidents have overwhelmingly been good and decent men. With the knowledge they had, they loved their country, and they wanted the best for it and for the office they held. And then I thought I might just tell one more story about the White House that I hope you find amusing. The annual White House Easter egg roll dates back to Andrew Johnson's administration. Then it was just a family affair. Eggs were dyed on Easter Sunday and rolled along the lawns on Monday morning. For me, 2006 will always be known as the year of the great Easter egg caper. That Easter Monday morning, a member of the social office noticed that a 70-year-old lady who was a longtime volunteer for the roll, instead of working, she was repeatedly visiting the porta potty on the south lawn. Concerned, the staffer told a member of the White House visitor's office, who walked over and opened the bathroom door. Inside, the volunteer was stuffing masses of wooden Easter eggs into her girdle. The White House staff then began a search of other senior citizen volunteers, and they uncovered a widespread ring. The women were surreptitiously taking the eggs and coloring books into the large porta potties and slipping them under the stalls to a ringleader who was hiding the contraband in a bright yellow trash bag that she'd removed from the bathroom trash can. From there, they planned to smuggle them off the grounds. Instead of creating a scene, the White House staff redirected the women to work at the food tent, serving egg salad. The staff then took down their names, and they were permanently removed from the volunteer list. And then to go on, something else you probably don't know about the White House, but Nancy Reagan probably does. Sadly, pilfering was a common problem at the White House. Guests would walk out of the washrooms with hand towels stuffed into their jackets or purses. One prominent television personality was known for having a collection of White House paper hand towels monogrammed with the presidential seal in her own powder room. She'd accumulated them when she came for interviews. Over the years, guests had removed pieces of flatware to the point where one set of silver engraved with the words, "The President's House," was so popular as a souvenir that we used it only in the private dining room upstairs. Guests helped themselves to the Vermeil Eagle place car holders. After these repeatedly vanished from the dinner tables, we asked the butlers to remove the card holders before dessert was served. Some visitors even took the dangling cut glass pieces from the sconces that hung in the ladies' room on the ground floor. There were times when the social secretary's staff joked that we should have guests walk through the magnetometers on the way in and again on the way out. Thank you all. Thanks. Now I think we have questions and answers.
Oh.
Do we?
Yes, we do.
Oh, good. Oh, there you are. Thanks. Thanks, John.
A number of you were kind enough to write questions for Mrs. Bush, and I've got several here. I don't know that we'll have time to get through them all, Mrs.
Okay.
Bush. We'll give it a try. When you were young, did you ever think you wanted to be First Lady?
No. I never did. I really didn't. I mean, it was just something that I didn't think of. I remember watching Jackie Kennedy. President Kennedy was assassinated right during my senior year, and I remember watching her in the long funeral, watching that weekend on television. And then Lady Bird Johnson, I always admired because she was a Texas First Lady, and she loved the native plants and the wildflowers in the landscape, which I did too. And I was at graduate school when President Johnson died, and his body lay in state at the Johnson Presidential Library. And everyone lined up, thousands of people lined up to walk through, and Lady Bird Johnson and Linda and Lucy stood and shook everyone's hand. And so I lined up and shook their hand then. But it would never have occurred to me, even then, that I would ever live in the White House.
Can you tell us about your first date with George?
Well, I started to read that passage to you, but George moved back to Midland. We had both grown up in Midland. We'd been together in the 7th grade, and then the Bushes moved to Houston when George was in the 8th grade. And then he moved back after graduate school in 1975, and some of my closest friends were his childhood friends as well. And every time I came home to Midland to visit my parents, Joey O'Neill would sort of talk up George, but I thought, well, I wouldn't really be interested. I wasn't particularly interested in politics, and I knew his dad had run for Senate in Texas. And so anyway, finally, a couple of years after George moved there, Jan and Joey invited us for dinner together when I was at home visiting my parents, and then we married 3 months later. And the most nervous people were not the bride and groom, but Jan and Joey O'Neill, who had fixed us up.
What was the best part of being First Lady, and what was the worst part?
Well, there are so many really, really good parts, I think, about being First Lady. The chance to represent our country that the First Lady has, and that I got to do representing our country in Africa, for instance, where many, many more people are on antiretrovirals for AIDS. Because of the generosity of the American people. And the people in Africa know that, and they're very thankful. And that was really wonderful to be able to represent our country that well. And then to be able to see so many great projects in the United States and great programs in every single town. And I always got to see the very best of our country traveling there. So those are two of the best parts. And then I think I'll have to say the worst part is the press. Where are the press? Only kidding. I know they always get the last word. But I did put in my book how I was struck when President Reagan died and the funeral was at the National Cathedral, how the commentators talked and wrote about him, which was not the way they had talked and written about him when he lived there. And Nancy and I think I mentioned that, but that's the hardest part, I think, is the scrutiny, not the press. We really need the press. I mean, we need each other. The president needs the press to be able to get out his message to to the American people and to people around the world, frankly, because every problem from around the world comes to the desk of the President of the United States. And but the hard and harsh criticism is difficult.
Please tell us how you and George, this person must be familiar with George, are enjoying your retirement. Was it a relief to leave Washington, D.C.?
We are really enjoying our retirement in Dallas. We're back home. We lived in Dallas 14 or 15 years ago now, before George and I moved to Austin to the governor's mansion. So we're back in our home, and we're working on building the Presidential Library. We've been getting a lot of advice from Library Foundation directors and the library director here on things to do, things to include in the library as we build it, and the most mundane advice is very needed when you're building as big a complex as this, like how big to have your auditorium space, or that other sort of advice. So we're working on that. We've already started the Institute programming. The George W. Bush Institute will be part of the library. We just hosted a conference on cyber dissidents, ways that dissidents around the world now can use the internet to get above their tyrannical governments. And I hosted in March the U.S. Afghan Women's Council with American and Afghan women to talk about literacy and education for women and girls in Afghanistan. So that's what we'll do for the rest of our lives. And you know, it was not a relief really to move home, but after a while I realized how stressed I'd been when I lived there. I didn't know it until I wasn't stressed. And then all of a sudden I even felt taller. But it was a privilege to get to live there, and an honor.
Now that your time in the White House is over, who brings you coffee in the morning?
My husband. But I will say, on that very first morning when we moved back home, he got up and he was having trouble making the coffee maker work. And this is really, when you leave the presidency, it is a stark change. We flew to Midland, and all of our friends in Midland showed up to welcome us back to Texas. And then we flew on to our ranch with a lot of our closest friends to come stay with us at the ranch. And we landed at the ranch. We drove in, and George was the one who was unloading the bags out there in the garage and putting the bicycles up. And so it's a quick come down.
As a mom, I know you'll like this. And how are Jenna and Barbara doing?
Great. I'm glad you asked. In fact, I'll report on all our family members. Jenna and Barbara are doing very well. Jenna is teaching reading at her school in Baltimore part-time, and then she's working as a contributing correspondent for the Today Show, which has given George a new punchline for his jokes about Jenna is just continuing the tradition of warm relations with the media that the Bush family has. But we've been having fun watching her. She's just on every once in a while, and but she did go to the Olympics with them, and she's doing great. And Barbara has founded a nonprofit called Global Health Corps that places recent college graduates in health clinics for the poor. And these are young, smart kids that can do stuff like set up the technology for a health clinic or other things like that. And if you're interested, you can look on the web at ghcorps.org, Global Health Corps. So they're both doing great, and I'll report on President Bush and Barbara. They were just in Dallas on Saturday night. Last summer, when we went to Maine for President Bush's 85th birthday, George's assistant met Barbara's assistant, and they got married on Saturday night. But we did go for the birthday celebration last summer when President Bush, again, of course, celebrated by jumping out of an airplane. And in Maine, this largest space to jump into was the churchyard. And Barbara Bush joked that was convenient. If anything went wrong, we could just wheel him straight on into the church. And she's doing very well. You probably read that she was in the hospital a few weeks ago, but she's doing great. And they were at the wedding with us, and then they went on to Maine for the rest of the summer. But they're all doing well. And thank you for the question.
What one piece of advice would you give teenagers as they prepare to go out to the real world?
Well, that is a very good question. I think I would say to find what you really like to do best. Think about what you like to do best and prepare yourself for that. And that's what I did. I didn't realize it at the time, but in retrospect, I loved to read. That was my favorite thing to do. And so I became a librarian. So I think if young people will really look at what their favorite things are and think about it and then see if there's a way they can make their life out of it, I think they'll be happier.
What was your most humorous moment as First Lady?
Let's see. We had a lot of funny moments. One of the things I loved best about George when I met him and married him so quickly was his sense of humor and how quick he is and how funny he is. I'm trying to think of some funny moments. We had a lot of funny moments with our dog. And we loved to laugh at the antics of our animals. But remember when Barney bit a reporter? I had this very hilarious person in my correspondence shop, and she wrote all of Barney's letters when Barney got letters from people. And so my big packet of correspondence came over, and I was signing letters and going through them, and come to find out there was a letter to me and George from Barney in the mail. And Barney apologized about biting the reporter, and he said it was all a mistake. He thought the guy was with the New York Times.
Another mother-type question. Where were your daughters on September 11th, 2001?
The girls were both freshmen in college. Jenna was at the University of Texas, and Barbara was at Yale. And Barbara woke up to the sound of a girl down the hall crying because this girl was crying because her little brother was in a school that was close to Ground Zero, and she had heard about it. And then Jenna was awakened by her Secret Service agents, and both of them were taken by their agents to a secure place. I mean, they were taken away from the school and taken somewhere. And I talked on the phone to both of them as soon as I could get them. And Barbara cried on the phone. I mean, it was very, very unsettling for both of them, like it was for all of us, of course. But they were in their secure location, feeling sort of isolated from their friends that they were close to. But they did it, and I noticed this when I was working on the book and went back to my schedule. They came to Washington 2 weeks later. So really, almost as soon as commercial flights started flying again, they came to be with us. And it's interesting when you look back at your schedule because everything happens so fast, and there's so much, and there's so many events that it's sort of interesting in retrospect to look back. I noticed that the month before we went into Iraq, that a lot of our Midland friends came. Some of George's best friends from the second grade, and I could tell they were coming now in retrospect just to be with George because they knew what he was agonizing over. And Barbara and Jenna also. Barbara spent her spring break with us that March, and Jenna spent part of hers with us. So, I could see that they were feeling anxious, and they wanted to be there with their dad.
I think we have time for 2 more questions,
Okay.
And then we're out. Do you ever take real vacations with your friends?
I do. I hike with my friends every year. I have a group of 4 women, 5 of us in all, that I grew up with in Midland, that I've been best friends with for all these years. And we hike in the national parks. We started when we were 40. We hiked in the Grand Canyon, or we floated on the river, the Colorado River, and then hiked the 10 miles out. And then for several years, while George was governor, we had entered the national park concession to hike in Yosemite, to hike from those tented camps to tented camps. And we never were drawn. So after George was elected, I called him and said, guess what? We won the lottery. And that very first year, we hiked in Yosemite, which I think is the most beautiful national park. They're all magnificent, but Yosemite is so beautiful. And I'm glad we did it that first year, because we couldn't do that difficult of a hike now, I think. But we travel every year. This summer, we're going to Wyoming to the Grand Tetons. And don't worry, we won't be trying to climb the Grand or anything like that, but we'll be doing some nice strolls around the park.
Last one. What values did you learn from growing up in West Texas?
Well, I think, and I wrote a lot about this in the book, because one of the really great things about writing a memoir is having the chance to look back on your life, but with the vantage point of this age and experience, that many things happening to you in that long of a life. And one of the things that I see that I think really formed George and me, because he grew up there as well, was how the landscape itself is so wide open. There are no native trees in Midland. It was the very bottom of the high plains when it was settled. It was all tall grassland. It's now, of course, it was plowed and it was grazed, and now it's more desert. But I think it gave us both sort of a wide open view that translated really into a character trait of ours, and plainness of speech and sort of a bluntness of talk that comes from growing up in a place where you couldn't discuss or debate things too long, or you'd burn up or freeze or starve. So I think both of those, and there's sort of a strength of character of people all that settled all of the United States, American West, that came from the people who came before us, that settled out of here. The first people that settled in Midland had to live in a dugout. There were no, there were no trees, so there was no way to build wooden houses. So they just dug a big hole in the sand and put kind of a tarp over the top of it to live in. And that's some kind of courage. And I think that is something that really formed both George and me. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you so much for coming out. I appreciate it a lot. Thank you. Thanks so much, John.